Did you turn it off by accident then?
Okay, now it's on again.
All right.
Might be 2 recordings after that. Okay.
I'm so happy to see you all, really.
I was in another study session, and there was a friend of yours in there who had recommended that you write a popular version of this text. And I told him that I thought I'd heard you say you were working on one, and I wanted to double check.
Yes, I am. Working
Awesome.
in the loose sense
Yeah.
of a gerund that can include most of the future and not necessarily the present.
Well, I'm amazed at the seemingly endless amount of creative energy you pour into the world, and I'm happy to be the beneficiary, one of the many beneficiaries of it.
I appreciate that. Like, as you can imagine, I think of all the times when I'm not getting anything done, mostly when I think about my work.
Oh my goodness, I mean, maybe you live at hyperspeed or something.
Well, you know, yeah, pushing oneself, it can be a good thing or a bad thing. But mostly for me, it's a good thing. Keeps me feeling alive. Is there any questions about the material we're going to be playing with today, or about stuff that we've already discussed?
As usual, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So on page 76, you talk about the different interpretations: physical, behavioral, ethical, and transformational. Mm-hmm. And you talk about in the behavioral realm, you talk about dominion. And I'm just wondering if at some point today you can expand on what you mean by dominion.
Yeah, maybe. The reason why I say maybe is because I actually had planned on focusing on that section in the following week, but okay, maybe we'll have time to anyway.
I could wait also.
Yes, that's okay.
Thanks, David.
We had a bunch of material that we didn't finish doing, but we touched on last week in chapter 1. So I want to make sure that we touch on that again today, just kind of get the basics down. Is that Richard?
It is.
Good, nice to see you.
Same here.
Yeah, I'm still learning people's names. Jenny, do you want to play us some clarinet at some point before the end? Can't hear you. I think you're saying something, Jenny, but we can't hear you. But if you want at some point to come on and do some clarinet. I think you're muted on your end, or something's off on your end, Jenny. Ah, okay. But when you get on, when your sound is working, let us know. Okay, so we also talked at the end about rabbinic anthropology in the last class, and that's actually possibly the most important point to get a grasp of in what we're talking about. So we talked about how the rabbis had this idea that there were upper creations and lower creations, and that's how somehow humans were the one species of being that is both an upper creation and a lower creation, and because of that we're a pivot around which creation is unified. And so it creates an interesting way of looking at anthropocentrism. Do you recall that we were just touching on this last class? Am I ringing bells? Yes. So I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page about that. And I talked about the axle and the spokes of a wheel, and how no axle thinks that it's the reason for the wheel's existence, right? So this idea that we're the pivot for the rabbis meant mostly an expression of responsibility. Not only, there were certainly people who took a more perspective that looks more like what we call dominion or domination, but mostly our centrality refers to the fact that we are needed by creation in order to help creation, not because we get to do what we want. And so one of our main functions is to create unity in creation. And according to the rabbis, the very fact of how we are structured or created enables us to fulfill that task. That's not different than the Kabbalistic perspective on the same idea. It just uses a different language or different symbols, but it's basically the root, one of the roots of the simple Kabbalistic idea. Not simple exactly, but fairly fairly compact idea that the reason why we do rituals is because they affect the cosmos by bringing, and the way they affect the cosmos is to bring blessing into the cosmos, so that we do rituals to serve creation, not to serve ourselves. Yeah, everyone's on that page, or on that that idea, and got it. So now I'm going to look at a few, or talk briefly about some of the things we didn't touch on directly from the end of chapter 1 last week, but which I think you read. Mainly, there are intellectual interpretations of Tselem Elohim, the image of God. But unlike medieval philosophy, there's no one who interprets Tselem Elohim as a purely intellectual or spiritual thing. It always is found in the body as well. And that's critical, because what happens is, again, I think I'm repeating a bit, but I think it's worth repeating. What happens is that in medieval philosophy, including Maimonides, who is one of my eco-heroes, but still, even in Maimonides, there's this idea that the image of God is only the intellectual or the spiritual, and that it, by definition, has nothing to do with the physical at all. By definition, cannot, because God can't be physical, and therefore the image of God can't be physical. So that's not what the rabbis said. And that picture of the world, which rejects the body, is what was rejected itself by the Kabbalah. So the whole passion of the Kabbalah, one of its center points is that the body is the image of God. So when the Kabbalists talk about becoming in the image of God, like Moshe Cordovero, which we'll get to later in depth, he says, if you don't make your soul, your person, your character, your virtues like God's image, which he defines, for example, as having compassion on all beings, including all categories of being, not just human beings, but animals, plants, etc. So having compassion on all beings is an expression of becoming in God's image. He says, he doesn't say, if you don't have that, you're not in God's image. That's what Maimonides would say. He would say, if you haven't developed your intellect in the right way to contemplate God, then you're not, essentially not in God's image on some level, right? But what Cordovero says instead is, then people will say, you have a body that's in God's image, but a soul that is ugly. And then he says, what's the point of having your body be in God's image if you don't try to make your soul also in God's image? So that's a big difference. And so much rides on that difference. So even when the rabbis associate the image of God with intellect, they associate it with speech, with something physical. When they want to associate it with something that's more symbolic, they associate it with upright posture. But it's the physical upright posture that is a reminder of God's image. It's not an idea about something that's invisible. It's an idea about something that's visible, that's physical. So that's the main thing I wanted to point out. Is everyone clear about that? You have a hand up, Gil? I can't hear you.
I'm struggling with this, David.
Tell me.
Well, the identification of Tselem with qualities rather than physical, I don't hear as a medieval rejection of physicality, but as a reflection of the notion that ein lo guf, ein lo dmut haguf. There is no physicality in form for God as we understand it. When Cordovero says compassion on all beings is an expression of Tselem, well, that it's embodied, but it's not body like body parts. So
no, he says your body, your physical body would be in God's image, but your soul wouldn't if you don't have compassion. So
Okay.
if you don't have compassion, your body still is in God's image.
Yeah.
That's
So
his point.
so he's both splitting body and soul, and he's asserting that there's an image of God that somehow our bodies are like, and I'm jammed up there.
Yeah. So the expression he uses exactly is a beautiful form whose deeds are ugly.
Yeah.
You become without showing compassion on all
Yeah,
life.
I got that.
You're a beautiful form, meaning your body is a beautiful form.
Yeah.
Whose deeds are ugly.
Yeah.
So the body remains in God's image, whether the rest of the neshama has done that or not. So
no, I'm clear on that distinction. I'm not
okay.
clear, and I don't expect to get clear right, today or maybe ever, on what it means for the body to be in the image of God who has no body and has no image.
Pardon me, I got to turn off my phone.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go on.
That's okay, and I'm willing to sit in the paradox of that. I don't expect you to just wave your hands and make it clear, but that's where
That's
I'm.
fine, but I'd like to get clear
All right.
about what your question is, if I could.
Let me try it again.
Okay.
How can we speak of our bodies being in the image of God when God has no body and no image? I mean, image, and this is the reason why you wrote a whole book about this. The very concept of Tselem is very challenging.
Mm-hmm. And Jenny, do you have a hand up for a second? I still can't hear you. Oi, Gewalt.
Got to unmute.
Wait, now?
Yes, now we hear you.
Okay, sorry. Really, but I was just gonna say ignore me because I was thinking that was the question that Gil was asking, and so I was like, oh, maybe.
Okay, so we got it.
Give me a second.
So that is a paradox, and the rabbis weren't bothered by that paradox because they were not, strictly speaking, trying to be philosophically coherent. On the other hand, their way of saying the body was in God's image was also much lighter than the Kabbalah. So for the body to be in God's image for the rabbis meant that our upright posture was symbolic of God's image or presence in us, but not that is itself God's image, because if that is itself God's image, then that would imply that someone that has to walk with a cane stooped over is no longer in God's image. By the way, where there is someone in medieval times who says that, strange idea. But the rabbis wouldn't have said that. And they said that the reason why there's a law in the Torah that says if someone gets hung for a capital crime, you're not allowed to leave the body hanging because you have to show respect to it because the body is in God's image. And so it's physical, but it's not especially concrete. But for the Kabbalists, right, it's like they'll talk about how the lines in your hand spell out Yud He Vav He, and that's God's image. Or they'll talk about how the relationship between the liver and the heart and the spleen is like Chesed Gevurah Tiferet, and that's God's image. The spleen might not be the right one there. Liver is for sure Gevurah. I guess what would be Chesed? Because heart should be Tiferet. Nishtahin nishtaher. You get the picture, the main point there. And or like the as I talk about in the book, there's a whole thing in the Kabbalah about how the lines in your forehead represent an image of God. So the way it works for the Kabbalists is that the whole body is in God's image in a very physical way, so that your right eye is Chesed and your left eye is Gevurah, right? Your heart is Tiferet, right? Your two legs are Netzach and Hod. Yesod is your genitals, and Malchut is sort of the earth that supports you. So that's extremely physical. I'm worried that we have lost Gil. Can you still hear us, Gil? It would be a shame for Gil not to hear us while I'm trying to delve into that. Let me pause on that in case Gil can't hear us, and we'll come back to it. Okay. For the Kabbalists, I'll just say the paradox wasn't resolved. It was intentionally paradoxical, and that didn't bother them. Were you able to hear what we were saying up till now, Gil?
No, I'm sorry. I had to step away for a delivery. I apologize.
Okay.
I'll listen to the recording.
Okay. Well, just in a nutshell, the details of the body themselves were seen as being in God's image for the Kabbalists in a way that was not true for the rabbis. So the rabbis had a much lighter idea of God's image. They also had a much lighter idea about what it meant to say God is not a body,
Yeah.
or have a body. And so they didn't have any problems doing all kinds of what we would call anthropopathic descriptions of God.
What was the word?
Anthropopathic, human feeling. God
Okay.
has human feelings.
Ah.
And in early Jewish mysticism, you have books like Shiur Koma, which talk about the measurements of God's body parts. And even though that was not mainstream or normative part of discussion, it was part of rabbinic tradition as well. So they didn't have the same intensity of feeling about this idea that God can't have a body. It was a fact that they believed in, or a truth that they believed in, but it wasn't sort of like on the top of their list of things they needed to worry about the way it was for the medieval philosophers.
And was this carried from earlier traditions, or was this their chiddush around then, the Kabbalists?
That God does have that the human body is in all its particulars God's image?
Yeah, and that God has what we think of as a physical body with dimensions and so forth. That just seems...
No, that's earlier. That's not later. Later Kabbalah takes that text and transforms it.
Yeah. Okay.
Before that, and again, we're not going to get till chapter 6, but it's a little preview of what this means because it's relevant. In rabbinic literature, mainstream, Talmud, Mishnah, Agada, Midrash, all this, Midrash Halacha, Midrash Agada, Targumim. You don't have discussion of God having a body or the idea that God has a body. The opposite. Anytime anything in the Torah sounds like God has a body, like God's arm outstretched, as we talk about all the time at this time of year in Passover. So if God has an arm, then God has a body, right? But in all cases, in the Targumim, that's the Aramaic translations, they'll change the language so that it doesn't mean God's arm, they'll change it to say God's power instead of saying God's arm, because they want to avoid the implication that there's anything physical about God in any sense. Even in a metaphorical sense, they want to kind of repress those metaphors from the Torah itself. They want to repress them. At the same time, in mysticism, in this period, there is this very strange book. It's a book about which Maimonides says it would be better for it to be burned and never mentioned again. Okay, but it's a real book, and it measures God's nostril in light years. And how long is God's nose? In light years, essentially light years.
That's Shiur Koma?
Shiur Koma, yeah.
I don't want to just hold us here on this one topic, but I do have one question about it. And that is, do you attribute this medieval backing off from the body as, Greek influence? Is this following Greek philosophy, the mind-body split and so forth?
It's partly Greek philosophy. I think it's also more subtly, it's the influence of Greek philosophy in the idea that your ways of thinking should be coherent. Right? That is, rabbinic Judaism doesn't have much trouble having contradictory ideas and holding them together as one system. In fact, it's a trademark of rabbinic thought. And if you want to look more into this, read the books by Max Kadushin. It's completely normative in rabbinic tradition that if you want to say something more complicated, you say it by saying two contradictory things and holding them both to be true. And of course, the key then becomes when is one emphasized versus the other. But that is characteristic of rabbinic thought. And so coming into full interaction with Greek philosophy, there's a drive. It is also the idea that somehow the body is less and the spirit is more important. That is part of Greek philosophy, but it's also simply the idea that ideas should be consistent.
I'm also wondering exactly kind of historically when this happened and to what extent surviving trauma and the loss of so many bodies impacted this idea. Because Thomas Berry talks about sort of the industrial revolution and split from nature as largely being a result of kind of this unprocessed traumatic reaction to the plague. And I'm wondering to what extent that, you know, that might influence some of these historical ideas in Judaism that, you know, the trauma of any given era, you know, pushed us farther from the body, since so many bodies are lost.
It's a really interesting question, which I haven't actually contemplated before. So I can't say I have much of an answer. What I can say is that our trauma about bodies is largely processed in terms of persecution of the Jewish people. And that comes out to a large degree in our ways of understanding chosenness and the importance of the Jewish people to God, and the idea of a kind of superiority complex, if one wants to psychoanalyze it, that has its roots in an inferiority complex, right? So I think that's where that trauma gets more processed. But I'm not really sure, Deborah. It's a fair and good question that I don't know the depth of.
And that processing is intellectual, which again is a rejection of the body, of what's really happening with the body. It might be a result of what's happening with the body.
So one way to think about the whole Jewish environmental movement nowadays, and the work that I'm doing, and that I did in my book, and that a lot of other people are doing, you know, getting back to Jewish farming, and is about getting back to embodiedness, or also Kohenet, all these kinds of movements within modern Judaism, that there's an awareness that however beautiful rabbinic teachings are, in a way they disconnected from the body. And it's not necessarily rabbinic teachings per se, but rabbinic teachings as they evolved over time through centuries, many more centuries later, of persecution. So that we had all these deep wisdoms about the earth that we didn't really bother talking about, or trying to understand, or trying to go into depth to, because in a way, we were just living in our trauma. Yeah, so another question, Avr's question would be to ask, what is it about the time we're in now that enables us to set aside those traumas and look at the body in a new way? And I think there's a bunch of different answers one could give to that are...
I mean, in some ways, we're in an age of even greater trauma and risk to the body, from not only climate change, but air pollution, water pollution, food pollution. You know, every source of sustenance is poison. And so it's odd that it's almost a compound. We could say, well, we have so much more freedom and so many more resources and so much more interconnection. But at the same time, we are so much more threatened. So that's just another interesting paradox.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, Jenny.
I was just thinking about this, I don't know, a variety of the ideas that were just said, and they were kind of synthesized in some way for me that I'm just sharing. I don't know whether it's right or interesting or not, but that as there was a trend toward, let's just say, mainstream society for the moment, maybe starting, starting toward the end of medieval times into the Renaissance, toward caring more and valuing more data and science and coherence of an argument. It's almost like we've gone, there was a time when perhaps it felt easier to hold the idea that our value was primarily spiritual, and at the same time, physical rituals and physicality could be important in certain ways, because there wasn't a problem with both of those things being true. And as we veered toward wanting things where we can see evidence and where there's a coherence to the whole theory, if the theory got too big for what we could hold in our heads, or the data weren't available, then we would tend toward creating a coherent theory, which might mean throwing away traditions that just plain didn't fit that theory. And maybe we've just swung so far in that direction that we're starting to realize that we don't know everything, and we can't know everything, and the complexity is beyond what we can actually have a coherent theory for. And so it's okay. So there's value in reaching back to things that we may not fully yet understand how they fit into the coherent theory. Nonetheless, we've seen that they've had value in the past, and there's something that's missing in our present that perhaps these things can help us with. And so we reach toward embodied practices and land-related practices.
I think I understood what you said, although it was a rather large thought.
Yeah, sorry.
Anyone else want to ask Jenny a question about that? No? Okay. It makes sense to me. Really, the problem is, one of the fundamental aspects of all this is that modernism was supposed to cure everything, and it's failed in an extraordinary way, in a way that might cause us to go extinct. So, faced with that failure, it's only right to question how did we get here, which is a lot of what Jenny was talking about, that at least the part that I understood well, I think, right? You know, so we're unearthing, we're doing an archaeology of rabbinic knowledge to riff off or maybe steal from Michel Foucault, because I can't really say I've understood Michel Foucault, but that idea, an archaeology of rabbinic knowledge or an archaeology of Jewish knowledge or Jewish wisdom. How does it come to be? What are its cul-de-sacs, its dead ends, its highways? What are its paths that go through forest, and what are its paths that go through deserts, etc.? So, continuing a little bit further with what we were just talking about, the last section, which I actually suggested that we start with today, which is on page 73, it's Tselem and Soul. So the rabbis did not accept the idea that there was a distinction between Tselem and the body. But they did accept that there was some kind of distinction between the soul and the body. It wasn't a radical dualism the way it was in some versions of Hellenistic thought. It was again a lighter kind of dualism, but still there was this idea that the soul and the body come together for the life of a person, and then they get separated again at the end of one's life, and that the soul has its own journey separate from the body's journey, essentially. And that idea is consistent all the way from Rabbinic Judaism till the present time. Now, the Sadducees don't seem to have believed in that idea. That is, they thought the idea of a world to come, the idea of a world to come wasn't accepted by them. The idea that the body has a different journey than the soul seems to have not been accepted by them, although it's not really certain what they believed and what they didn't believe. Yeah, but just in terms of what we do know. So there was a choice, a cultural choice made there, which was in a way to adapt to Rabbinic Judaism certain Hellenistic ideas, but not the most extreme ones. And why that is worth looking at. In fact, that's a big part of not this chapter, but which chapter is it in? Chapter 4? Yeah, chapter 4 is all about this. But what is also important is that they didn't see Tselem and soul as overlapping in any significant way. So later rabbinic thought, specifically medieval, specifically the philosophers, would either say that the intellect is the image of God or the soul is the image of God, separate from the body, in both cases separate from the body. But the rabbis didn't have this idea. Tselem and soul are different things. They're not congruent. They're not coextensive with each other. And so even though there was a dualism between body and soul, the fact that Tselem did not fit into that dualism in a way saved Rabbinic Judaism from a certain kind of more extreme version of Hellenism. Yeah. That make sense? No, not so much.
Taking it in.
Taking it in? We see Ellen again. Hi. Simcha.
There's some material about contacts between the Maccabees and the Hashmonaim and Greece in the kind of in that period of pre-Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if there's any connection in there between this idea and the Greek more the kind of stricter dichotomy that the Greeks draw
With the Hashmonaim?
Between body and soul.
Yeah, but
I'm just talking about it intellectually. In Plato and Aristotle, the ideas of and their students, the ideas about body and soul, and the rabbinic ideas. And if you have any kind of pointers of things to read in that direction.
this goes to chapter 4. So I'll give you a little bit, and then we'll wait to go into that further, more deeply. The important thing to understand is that Hellenism is not one thing. That's essential. So there was Alexandrian Hellenism and Antiochian Hellenism. And we know most about this from Christian theology. So going back to the time of the full-on Greeks and the Hasmoneans and all that, we don't really know enough about. But later, in the time when rabbinic thought is forming and rabbinic texts are being written, there was a clear distinction between Antiochian Hellenistic ideas and Alexandrian Hellenistic ideas. So in a nutshell, for the Alexandrians, the image of God was the soul and the body was not the image of God. Period. Punkt, as they say. And for the Antiochians, the soul plus the body together make the image of God. And the body by itself is not the image of God, but the soul by itself, although exalted, is not the image of God, because the image of God refers to something that is manifest in the world as they understand it. So basically, Philo of Alexandria followed Alexandrian Hellenism, and the rabbis followed Antiochian Hellenism. And so what we think of as Hellenism is the Hellenism of the Western Church that we still can see directly around us in various forms of Christianity. That's what we think of as Hellenism. But the other kinds of Hellenists, the Antiochian ones, they were all excommunicated from the church. And so those ideas still live, but they don't live in the Catholic Church. They live in some forms of what are seen as heretical forms of Christianity that are very minority. And some of their ideas are also present in the Eastern Orthodox Church as well. Yeah. So it could be simply geography and no other reason that the rabbis took the more gentle understanding of body-soul dualism and not the more radical one. And that reason why Philo follows the more radical one is just because he was in Alexandria, and that was like the thing you do in Alexandria. It's hard to know. Yes.
They were, I mean, there's that line in Pirkei Avot about Alexandria being a place of bitter water, that they really had it in for the Alexandrians.
Yes. At some point, a geographical distinction became a cultural distinction, became a cultural conflict. But exactly how that evolved or when that evolved, I mean, I don't think Philo of Alexandria understood himself to be in conflict with rabbinic Judaism. I think he thought he was well lined up with what Judaism was supposed to be. But his works were lost to Jews because they had no place in essentially in the philosophy and anthropology that the rabbis adopted, which was so antithetical in some ways to the extreme form of Hellenism that was practiced is the wrong term, I guess, but maybe believed in Alexandria. So Antioch is of course up the coast of the Mediterranean from Israel. It's not actually, I don't think it's actually closer physically than Alexandria, but I think in terms of trade routes and cultural exchanges, it was closer than Alexandria. to Palestine, I'm talking about, to the rabbis in Palestine, which is, of course, where the essence of the rabbinic tradition gets formed. You guys ready to go on to chapter 2? I doubt that we've answered all possible questions about chapter 1, but that's okay. I asked you in particular to look at some footnotes in chapter 2, 231 to 237. It's fine to look at them now. You don't have to have already looked at them. Yeah. But what I wanted to emphasize here is the physical interpretations of Tselem Elohim that are found in rabbinic literature. So again, the behavioral interpretations and the ethical interpretations, which are in many ways much more important for ecology and for what we're doing, I was going to mostly focus on next week, although we might get to some of that today. But I wanted to look at the physical ones here. So first of all, just looking at the headings in the chapter, right? You have Tselem and vision, that somehow the way human beings see is in God's image. That's one of the 4 things, right? It says we see like the angels, we speak like the angels, we are upright like the angels, and we perceive the future like the angels. 4 things. So that's one. Another thing is this conflict in rabbinic Judaism, where some texts seem to say that the fact that we are male and female is itself an expression of God's image, while at the same time other texts say that sexuality is like the animals and not like God's image. So there seems to be a kind of, I don't know, paradox, schizophrenia, inability to reconcile 2 realities, or perhaps perhaps no desire to reconcile these 2 seemingly contradictory realities. So what exactly is meant by that is important and difficult to parse out. The other section that was in here the other 2 sections were one, Tselem and snakes and dolphins, which relates to sexuality. Who read that section or knows what I'm referring to? So it seems that for at least some of the rabbis, dolphins and snakes were also in God's image. Yeah. And I have no idea where they got their biology from exactly, but the fact that, and again, this is not truth, this is what they said, snakes and dolphins have sex face to face, as opposed to face to back. Or some insects, actually, it's back to back in the way they.
So they're distinguishing snakes and dolphins from the rest of the animal kingdom.
Yes.
Right.
Or sometimes snakes and whales, depending on which text you're looking at. Now, they didn't have a dedicated term for whale. What they said was they would refer to the Dag Hagadol, the great fish that's in Jonah.
Okay, and what do they call?
We interpret to be a whale.
All dolphins?
Dolphins are called delphinim. Delphinim.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. That's easier.
Okay.
And they're all cetaceans, dolphins and whales.
Yeah. And what about Tanaim?
I didn't see anything about Tanaim in terms of the image of God.
Okay.
In these texts. So that's a fair question. Leviathan would be the paramount example. And then the last thing is the idea that's, the last 2 things are, one, that being circumcised is what makes you in God's image. Now that's a weird one, because that means that would seem to mean that not only are non-Jews not in God's image, but even women are not in God's image, if you take that way of thinking literally and simplistically. The Talmud, however, says that a woman's body is like a circumcised man's body, whatever that means. And then the last thing, which we've mentioned a bunch of times, is the idea that upright stature is an indication of our being in God's image. That's the 4th thing that we're like the angels in, right? We have upright stature, we see like the angels, which can mean seeing the future, but it can also mean physically how we see, right? We speak like the angels. And like the animals, we defecate, we eat, we have sex, and we die. So those are the 4 things that are like the animals. So in that dichotomy, our sexuality is not connected to God's image, but then there are these other texts which imply that our sexuality is related to God's image. And as I was saying before, I don't see any I don't see anybody resolving that contradiction, especially. So those are the things I want to go to, but I wanted to look at those footnotes about vision in particular, because I think they raise, for me anyway, interesting questions about what it means to try to use science to understand rabbinic texts. So the question is, what does it mean to say we see like the angels? And the Midrash specifically says, what do you mean? Do you mean an animal doesn't see? Doesn't an animal see? That's the next question immediately after.
Yeah.
And it says, Ela zeh sitrohi, this one, but this one to the sides. Do you know what that means?